An entire world can be contained within a single, forgotten map. Elara, a cartographer with a gentle heart, stands before the moss-covered entrance to Dreamwood Village, her parchment unrolled with a quiet reverence. The ancient archway seems to sigh as she begins her work, a sound felt more than heard, hinting at the stories waiting just beyond the veil. She is here to preserve the village's fading magic, to capture its essence in sketches and field recordings before it vanishes entirely. By the end of this journey, you will understand how to design a living world where every detail holds a story, and how to protect the fragile magic of a place simply by listening. What happens when a village itself is a sentient being, breathing its last whispers into the ears of those who care to listen? I am curious to know if you feel comfortable sharing where you are listening from right now and what the local time is for you. There is something special about connecting across distances as we step into this quiet tale. What do you think makes a place feel truly alive? Even if it only exists in our imagination, the archway hums beneath her palm, a vibration that travels up her arm and settles deep in her chest. It is not the cold stone she expected, but wood grown warm with a life of its own, its surface a velvet carpet of moss. The melodic resonance is a direct response to her touch, a clear sign that this gateway is a conscious guardian, not a passive structure. Elara freezes, her journal half open. To sketch this, to describe the specific frequency of the hum in her field notes, would be to document a miracle. But such a record could act as a beacon, drawing curious outsiders who might not understand the delicate balance they would be disrupting. Her duty as a cartographer wars with her deeper role as a protector. In that moment of hesitation, the decision is made for her. The hum softens, fading not into silence, but into a whisper that threads through the air, a gentle pull, guiding her gaze down the path toward the village square. The village is not just allowing her entry, it is actively leading her. Every step forward now feels like an acceptance of a pact, a silent agreement that her guide will be woven from the stories the village chooses to share. The weight in her satchel, once just parchment and ink, now feels like the weight of a shared secret. The air in the square tastes of cool stone and the sweet, yeasty promise of bread yet to be baked. Elara kneels on the cobblestones, her movements slow and deliberate as she sets down the brass listening horn of her recording device. The village is still wrapped in the deep blue quiet of dawn, and she fears that any sudden sound might shatter the delicate moment. But as she adjusts the device, the village itself begins to speak. A wooden shop sign, carved like a loaf of bread, groans softly as it swings in a breeze she cannot feel. From a rooftop, a sun sparrow chirps a single, clear note that seems to ring through the square like a tiny bell. These are the first sounds she captures, the foundational layer of her audio map. A soft click from a nearby window breaks her concentration. A baker, her face framed by flour-dusted hair, watches from the doorway of her shop, her expression a mixture of curiosity and caution. Elara's instinct is to shrink back, to become part of the scenery, an unseen listener. But the warmth of the fresh bun the baker holds in her hand, and the tentative smile she offers, feels like a test set by the village itself. To remain an observer would be to fail. She accepts the bun, its heat a comfort against her palm, and returns the smile. The baker's name is Anya, and her simple gesture unlocks the square's true nature. This is not just an empty space between buildings, Anya explains, her voice a low, warm hum. It is the village's heart, where news is exchanged not with shouts, but with the placement of a basket of apples on a certain bench, or where a child's laughter, echoing off the well at noon, can predict the next day's weather. The magic here is not grand or dramatic. It is woven into the mundane, into the daily rituals of life. Elara's project is no longer an abstract act of preservation. It is now tied to the breath of this community, to the trust she sees blooming in Anya's eyes. The baker points a flowery finger toward a lane shaded by willow trees. If you wish to hear the village dream, she says, follow the sound of the water. The murmuring stream holds stories that even we have forgotten. The sound of water grew from a suggestion into a clear, guiding melody, pulling Elara away from the warm stones of the square and down the willow-shaded lane. The air cooled, carrying the scent of wet earth and something else, something like the quiet after a long sleep. The stream was not wide, but its water was impossibly clear, flowing over smooth, colorful pebbles that seemed to hold the light of a forgotten sunset. Compelled by a force deeper than curiosity, Elara knelt on the soft bank and, without thinking, dipped her fingers into the current. Where her skin met the water, a soft, swirling light bloomed. It was not a reflection, but a reaction, a constellation of gold and silver embers swirling around her hand before fading back into the clear flow. The water itself was alive with dream energy, a river of sleeping thoughts and unspoken wishes. A sudden movement in the reeds across the stream caught her eye. A small, shimmering form retreated deeper into the green stalks, only two wide, luminous eyes visible, watching her with a mixture of fear and fascination. It was a water sprite, a creature of pure magic, and Elara had just intruded upon its sanctuary. Her cartographer's mind screamed to document this, to sketch the sprite's form and record the exact nature of the water's glow. But her heart, the part that had accepted the baker's trust, understood the fragility of the moment. Any sudden movement, the scratch of her pen, the click of a recorder, could shatter this chance encounter forever. Instead of reaching for her tools, she slowly withdrew her hand from the glowing water and settled herself more comfortably on the bank. She closed her eyes for a moment, searching for a gesture of peace, and found it in a half-remembered tune, an old mapping song her mentor used to hum while charting the stars. She began to hum it softly, a low, steady melody that wove itself into the sound of the babbling stream. The fearful tension in the air began to dissolve. After a long silence, a series of soft, chiming notes answered her hum. The water sprite emerged fully from the reeds, its body made of light and flowing water, and regarded her with a newfound curiosity. It was a bond formed not through force or demand, but through patience and a shared language of sound. The sprite gestured with a delicate hand, not toward the water, but upstream, to where the ancient, vine-covered stones of a circular building stood partly hidden by the trees. It was the library, the keeper of Dreamwood's oldest stories. By choosing empathy over documentation, Elara had not just avoided a disaster, she had been given a key. The true map of this village would not be drawn with ink, but with trust. The library door was a wall of ancient oak and living green, its surface cool and unyielding beneath Elara's hand. She pushed, but it held fast, the vines coiled tightly like sleeping serpents. A whisper escaped her lips, not a command but a confession. I am here to listen, to remember. The response was immediate. The vines stirred, unwinding with a soft rustling sound, slithering back into the mossy stonework to reveal the dark, waiting space beyond. This was no simple lock and key. It was a test of heart, and she had passed. Stepping inside was like stepping into a held breath. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, dried lavender, and a profound, watchful silence. Sunbeams, thick as honey, fell from high circular windows, illuminating countless swirling dust motes that danced like tiny spirits. Her awe was immediately shadowed by a creeping fear. The sheer weight of knowledge in this room, the countless leather-bound spines lining curved shelves that rose into shadow, made her feel small, an uninvited guest in a sacred place. The impulse to tiptoe, to barely disturb the dust, was powerful, but the gentle, melodic ringing she had heard from outside persisted, a soft chime pulling her deeper into the labyrinth. Her cartographer's discipline took over. Instead of rushing toward the sound, she slowly unrolled a fresh piece of parchment and began to sketch the sunbeams themselves, capturing the way they fell upon a reading desk, worn smooth by generations of hands. It was an act of reverence, a way of introducing herself to the library, not as a thief of secrets, but as a guest offering a gift of attention. In drawing the light, she noticed something she had missed. The patterns of dust motes were not random. They swirled in specific, repeating currents around certain shelves, as if the very air was avoiding them. One such shelf, deep in the heart of the room, was where the faint ringing seemed to originate. Her careful, respectful approach had revealed a hidden map within the library itself. The answers to the village's fading magic were not just in the books, but in the behavior of the space, in the paths one was meant to follow. The melodic ringing grew clearer, a patient, persistent call from a shelf that held not books, but a collection of strange crystalline bottles, each one glowing with a soft inner light. Her finger traced the delicate carvings on the shelf, each groove a frozen musical note. As her touch completed a silent melody, the wood itself responded. A single, pure chime rang out, a note so clear it seemed to cleanse the dusty air. The sound echoed through the circular room, and in its wake, 3 books on a high shelf began to glow with a gentle, golden light. Elara's breath caught. Her training as a cartographer screamed for her to document this miracle, to capture the exact pitch and resonance of the chime with her field recorder before the memory of it faded from her ears. But her heart pulled her toward the glowing texts, toward the immediate mystery they promised. This was the core conflict of her entire mission. Was her role to be an archivist, preserving moments in isolation, or a participant, following the story as it unfolded in real time? She made her choice. With hands that trembled only slightly, she set up her brass listening horn, aiming it toward the now silent shelf. She took a slow, steadying breath, and then ran her finger along the carved notes once more. The chime rang out again, and this time, her device captured its every vibration, storing the magical sound for eternity. As the last echo faded into the library's silence, something new happened. The book that glowed the brightest, a volume bound in what looked like woven moonlight, trembled on its shelf. Then it drifted forward, levitating just an inch from its resting place, as if offering itself to her. This was no longer just a moment to record, it was an invitation to be accepted. The stakes of her project shifted instantly. By choosing to honor the sensory magic first, she had been granted access to a deeper truth. She approached the floating book, not as a scholar seizing a prize, but as a guest accepting a gift. Her fingers closed around its cover, which was warm to the touch. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that opening this book would irrevocably change her understanding of Dreamwood. It would not just add a detail to her map, it would redefine the entire landscape of her quest. The village was not just sharing a story, it was trusting her with a piece of its soul. The cover of the book was not cold parchment, but something alive, warm like sun-baked stone. As Elara lifted it, a soft sigh escaped the pages, and the air around her filled with a shimmering, dream-like mist. The library vanished, replaced not by a vision she saw with her eyes, but a story that unfolded directly within her mind. She was no longer a cartographer in a quiet room. She was a witness to the very first dawn of Dreamwood. The founder was not a warrior or a king, but a weaver named Lyra, whose fingers did not just work with thread, but with the very substance of hope and memory. Elara felt the coarse wool in her own hands, saw the simple, half-built huts through Lyra's eyes, and understood the profound loneliness that had driven her to weave not just cloth, but comfort into the world. Lyra's greatest creation was a tapestry depicting a perfect, peaceful village, and as she worked, her deepest dreams bled from her fingertips into the threads. The moment she tied the final knot, the tapestry glowed, and the forest around her softened, the trees shifting, the stream finding a new course, the village of her dream becoming a physical reality. This was the magic, a genesis born not of spellcraft, but of heartfelt need and artistic sacrifice. The sensory overload was immense. Elara's training demanded she pull back, to analyze the mechanics of this psychic projection, to record the exact hue of the magical light or the temperature of the mist. But the emotion of Lyra's struggle, her quiet desperation and ultimate triumph, was a tidal wave that threatened to sweep away all scholarly distance. Her fingers trembled, caught between reaching for her precise measuring tools and simply clutching her heart. The conflict was paralyzing. How could she possibly translate this feeling, this intimate birth of a world, into the sterile lines of a map? To fail would be a betrayal of the village's trust. In a moment of clarity, she let her training and her empathy merge. She did not fight the story. Instead, she opened her journal to a blank page, dipped her quill, and began to speak in a soft, steady voice, narrating the tale as it played out in her mind. At the same time, her hand moved across the paper, not drawing measured diagrams, but sketching the impressions. The slope of Lyra's shoulders as she worked, the radiant pattern of the fateful tapestry, the awestruck faces of the first villagers as their new home materialized around them. It was a map of emotion, a cartography of Genesis. This decision fundamentally changed her role. She was no longer an outside observer. By giving voice to Lyra's story, she wove a part of herself into the village's origin myth. The stakes of her mission were now deeply personal. The tale reached its conclusion, and as the last images faded from her mind, the mist in the library began to thin. The book in her hands felt lighter, its glow dimming to a soft pulse. Just before the last wisp of dream vanished, a single whispered clue echoed in the silence of the room. Find the loom. The words were not heard with her ears, but felt in her bones. The urgency that settled over her was sharp and clear. Lyra's loom was not just a historical artifact. It was the heart of the magic, and Elara knew, with a certainty that left no room for doubt, that finding it was the only way to understand why the magic was now fading. Her map was leading her to the source. The path to the Weaver's Glen was more a suggestion than a trail, a seam in the forest that only revealed itself when the light fell at a certain angle. Elara followed the whispered clue, find the loom, her senses heightened, every rustle of leaves a potential sign. The air grew thick with the scent of damp earth and something like spun sugar. Then she stepped through a curtain of weeping willow branches and into a hidden world. The glen was a natural amphitheater, its center dominated by structures that blurred the line between art and life. Looms were not built here, they were grown. They were living willow trees, their branches trained and woven into enormous frames, where silver threads glimmered like captured moonlight. Around them, weavers moved with a quiet, fluid grace, their hands not just guiding thread, but coaxing it into patterns that shimmered and shifted even as Elara watched. One tapestry showed a field of stars that slowly swirled into the shape of a sleeping child's face. Another depicted a river that changed its course with the gentle rhythm of a breath. This was the active, beating heart of the magic Lyra had begun, a place where the village's collective dreams were given form. The awe she felt was immediately challenged. A tall woman with hair the color of weathered silver and eyes that held the deep green of the forest approached. She introduced herself as Mistress Willow, her voice calm but her gaze piercing. "You document with light and sound," she stated, her eyes flicking to Elara's recording horn. "But what do you do with the silence you collect? Do you understand that a dream, once recorded, becomes a fixed thing? It loses its potential to change." Elara's desire to preserve ward with the weavers' need to protect the fluid, living nature of their craft. To plead her case with grand promises felt hollow. So, instead, she offered something small and true. She spoke of her own quiet dream, not of fame or discovery, but of a deep, personal longing to find a place that felt like home, a connection that went beyond maps and ink. She confessed that in Dreamwood, for the first time, she felt that possibility. Her vulnerability hung in the air, a fragile thread. Mistress Willow studied her for a long moment, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. She gestured to a smaller, empty loom, nestled between the roots of an ancient willow. "You may record the sound of the loom for the length of one dream," she conceded. "But only one. Choose wisely." This was not full access, but a profound gesture of trust. Elara set up her device with trembling hands, aiming the horn not at the weavers, but at the loom itself. As a young weaver began to work, the whisper of the thread and the soft creak of the living wood created a gentle, rhythmic music. It was the sound of creation itself. And then, something impossible happened. The threads on the loom, without any hand to guide them, began to move on their own. They wove a new scene into the existing tapestry, a simple image of a woman with a satchel, standing before a village archway. It was Elara. Her own small dream of belonging had been woven into the fabric of Dreamwood. Mistress Willow's stern expression softened into something akin to wonder. She pointed beyond the glen to a place where the trees thinned and the sky opened. "Your journey does not end here, cartographer. The Starlight Meadow is where the dreams go when they are finished. If you wish to understand why they are fading, you must follow them there. The path ahead was now illuminated not just by moonlight, but by a thread of her own story, woven directly into the world she sought to save. The Starlight Meadow was a carpet of flowers that seemed to drink the last of the daylight, their petals glowing with a soft, internal luminescence. Elara lay on her back in the center of the clearing, the cool earth a solid comfort beneath her. As true dusk settled, the meadow came alive in a way she could never have sketched. From the burrows of sleeping rabbits and the nests of dozing birds, soft orbs of light began to rise. They were dream lights, each one a tiny, pulsing sphere of color. Lavender for peaceful slumber, gold for joyful adventure, a soft blue for quiet sorrow. They floated upward like lazy fireflies, weaving an intricate, silent ballet against the darkening sky. It was the most breathtaking sight of her journey, the village's collective subconscious made visible. Her hand instinctively went to her recording horn, and she held her breath, capturing the gentle, almost musical hum that emanated from the floating lights. But her presence and the soft whir of her device did not go unnoticed. A rustle in the flowers near her head broke the spell. A small, stout hedgehog spirit waddled into view, its quills shimmering with starlight and its eyes like tiny black beads, fixed on her with clear disapproval. It was a guardian of this sacred space, and she was an intruder. The spirit nudged her elbow firmly, then her satchel, a clear, wordless command to leave. Elara froze. To capture this phenomenon was the entire purpose of her guide, a vital record of the village's fading magic. Yet every nudge from the hedgehog was a reminder that her documentation was a disturbance. This was not a museum exhibit. It was a vulnerable, living process. The conflict was a physical pressure in her chest. She could stay, ignore the spirit, and get the perfect recording, but she would be violating the very trust the village had placed in her. Or she could respect the boundary being so clearly communicated. With a deep sigh of resignation, she made her choice. She slowly, deliberately, stopped the recording after only a few precious minutes. Then she began to gather her things, moving with exaggerated slowness to show she meant no harm. She bowed her head slightly toward the hedgehog spirit, a gesture of apology and respect. The nudging stopped. The little spirit watched her, its beady eyes seeming to assess her intent. As Elara rose to her feet to leave, something miraculous happened. One of the floating dream lights, a tiny sphere of warm, buttery yellow, broke from the upward drift of the others. It floated directly toward her, hovering for a moment before the hedgehog spirit gave a soft, chuffing sound, as if granting permission. The dream light then descended, landing softly in the palm of her outstretched hand. It was cool and weightless, humming with a gentle, happy energy before its light faded, leaving behind a smooth, crystal-like petal in her palm. It was a gift, a tangible piece of Dreamwood's magic, given not for taking, but for respectful receiving. Holding that petal, she knew the stakes of her quest had magnified. This was no longer just about preserving a story. It was about safeguarding a living gift, and the path, now faintly glowing in the moonlight, led onward to the final mystery, the Moonlit Pond, where the answers to the fading magic surely waited. The path to the Moonlit Pond was a ribbon of silver in the dark. each step taking Elara deeper into a silence that felt ancient and complete. The pond itself was a perfect circle of obsidian water, so still it seemed not to reflect the full moon above, but to contain a second, more potent moon within its depths. Compelled by a force she did not understand, Elara knelt at the water's edge and gazed down. Her own face did not look back. Instead, the dark surface swirled, and visions bloomed like ink in water. She saw the archway's moss turning brittle and gray, its welcoming hum silenced forever. She saw the village square empty, the cobblestones cracked and silent, the bakery dark. The dream lights in the meadow flickered and died, one by one, until only a cold, starless blackness remained. These were not mere possibilities. They were echoes of a future where the stories had been lost, where the magic had simply forgotten how to breathe. A cold dread, sharper than any winter wind, seized her heart. This was the consequence of failure, and the weight of it was terrifying. Her first instinct was to slam her journal shut, to never speak of these grim premonitions. What good would it do to share such despair? Would it not poison the very hope she was trying to cultivate? But as she watched one final vision, a single withered leaf falling onto the pond's surface, a different resolve hardened within her. To only document the beauty would be a lie of omission, a map that ignored the crumbling cliffs and the rising tides. The truth, no matter how painful, was the only thing that could inspire true preservation. She would document the pond's serene beauty, the way the moonbeams danced on its surface, but she would also frame these ominous visions for what they were, not an inevitable end, but an urgent call to action. This decision crystallized her purpose, transforming her guide from a simple record into a rallying cry. As if in response to her resolve, a new understanding flowed into her mind from the water itself. The magic was not just fading, it was cyclical, tied to the moon's phases. The visions were a warning that the current cycle was nearing its end. She had until the next full moon, one single lunar cycle, to complete her work and find a way to reinforce the village's fading connection to its own stories. The pressure was immense, a ticking clock woven from moonlight and fear, but it also brought a strange clarity. There was no more time for uncertainty. She knew exactly where she had to go. The final guardian, the one who held the memory of the land itself, was waiting. She had to seek the guardian of the grove. The oldest tree in the grove was a silent mountain of wood and moss, its roots sprawling like sleeping dragons across the forest floor. Elara approached it with a reverence that slowed her breath, the crystal petal from the Starlight meadow cool in her palm. This was not a place for demands or questions, only offerings. She knelt and gently placed the dream light's gift at the base of the massive trunk, a silent return of the magic she had been given. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, the moss at the base of the tree began to shift, to gather and rise. Bark twisted and reformed, and from the ancient wood emerged a figure of immense, quiet presence. The guardian of the grove stood before her, its form woven from living bark and soft moss, its eyes the color of deep, shadowed earth, holding a kindness that felt as old as the hills. "You carry a piece of our dream," it spoke, its voice not a sound but a resonance that vibrated in the soil beneath her feet. "But you also carry tools of preservation. Why do you seek to capture what is meant to be felt and then released?" Elara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was the confrontation she had feared since the moment she first touched the humming archway. The Guardian's warning was simple and devastating. To document magic is to risk defining it, it continued. A story written down can become a cage. The song of the loom, once recorded, may lose its spontaneity. Your very act of preservation could be the first step toward making our magic a relic, a thing of the past rather than a living breath. The accusation hung in the air, threatening to unravel her entire purpose. Her old self, the cautious cartographer, wanted to argue with data, to promise careful handling, but the woman who had walked this village's paths, who had shared bread with a baker and a melody with a sprite, found a different answer. She met the Guardian's ancient gaze. "I am not here to capture your magic in a jar," she began, her voice steady with a conviction that surprised her. "I am here to learn its song so that others might hear it, even from a great distance." A story locked away in a single heart can be forgotten, but a story shared, a wonder described that can plant a seed in 1,000 hearts. It is memory that gives magic its strength, the memory of joy, of peace, of belonging. My guide will not be a cage, it will be an invitation. Her words were not a defense of her project, but a declaration of a newfound belief. She was no longer just preserving a place, she was advocating for an idea, that shared wonder could be a shield against oblivion. The Guardian was silent, its mossy form utterly still. The grove itself seemed to be holding its breath, listening. Then a slow, deep warmth radiated from the entity, a feeling of approval that washed over Elara like sunlight. "You understand the balance," it resonated. "The map is not the territory, but a well-drawn map can lead a weary traveler home. Your guide will be an echo of our heartbeat, a reminder that such places can exist." With this blessing, the Guardian imparted not just permission, but a grave responsibility. The success of your work is now tied to our vitality. Each person who finds hope in your words will add a thread to our tapestry. Each one who remains indifferent will be a breath of wind that cools our embers. The stakes were no longer about completing a project, but about becoming a lifeline for the village itself. The Guardian's kind eyes seemed to look through her, into the future she was tasked with shaping. "Your final insight awaits," it murmured, its form beginning to sink back into the tree. "Seek the place where the first stories were kept, before the library was built. Find the hidden archive." The path forward was now a sacred charge, and Elara's map was nearly complete. The entrance to the hidden archive was not a door of wood or stone, but a solid wall of intertwined roots. Its surface, a mosaic of fossilized leaves. Each leaf was a unique shape, a tiny piece of a larger, silent pattern. Elara's fingers, still humming with the Guardian's blessing, traced the grooves and veins. This was not a lock to be picked, but a story to be read. She closed her eyes, letting the memory of the grove guide her touch, her fingers finding a rhythm, connecting a maple here to an oak there, following the narrative of growth and decay etched into the roots. With a soft, grinding sound, the root wall parted, sliding back to reveal a chamber that stole her breath. Inside, the air was cold and sharp, tasting of quartz and frozen time. The archive was not a room of books, but a geode of stories. From floor to ceiling, crystalline formations grew like ancient flowers, each one pulsing with a soft, internal light. 1,000 colors glimmered in the darkness, a silent symphony of every tale the village had ever held. The sheer scale of it was a physical blow. Her mission, which had felt so vital moments before, now seemed impossibly small. How could her single guide, her handful of pages, possibly capture this universe of memory. The weight of every untold story pressed down on her, a crushing responsibility. To choose one was to abandon 100 others. Each crystalline story she passed over would be a loss, a quiet extinction. Her cartographer's mind, trained for clarity, fought against the panic. She could not record everything. The guide would become a meaningless catalog, a jumble of noise. It needed a heart, a central theme that would make the magic understandable, that would make others care. She thought of Anya's warm bread, of the water sprite's chiming trust, of Mistress Willow's stern protection. She thought of Lyra's lonely dream of community. The answer crystallized. She would not choose the grandest tales of magic or the oldest myths of creation. She would seek out the stories of community and resilience, the small, everyday moments where the village's heart truly beat. Her fingers, now steady with purpose, reached for a crystal that glowed with the soft gold of dawn. As she touched it, a story unfolded in her mind, not of a great leader, but of two children who had mended a broken bridge by weaving ribbons into its ropes, their simple act of repair strengthening the entire village's connection. This was the theme. This was the thread that would bind her guide together. One by one, she touched the crystals that resonated with this idea, absorbing stories of shared meals after a storm, of songs invented to comfort a crying baby, of silent understandings between neighbors. With each selection, her guide gained focus and power. It was no longer just a record. It was an argument for the kind of world Dreamwood represented. This act of curation was the highest stake of all, for she was now actively defining the village's legacy. What she included would be remembered. What she omitted might fade forever. As she gathered the last of her chosen stories, she approached the central formation, a master crystal that seemed to hold the archive's silent awareness. She placed her hand upon it, offering up the essence of her work, the thematic map she had woven from Dreamwood's soul. The crystal did not just glow, it ignited. A brilliant, warm light flooded the chamber, and for a breathtaking moment, Elara felt her own consciousness merge with the archive. Her guide, her maps, her field recordings, they were no longer separate. They had been accepted, woven into the living memory of the village itself. The light subsided, leaving the crystal pulsing with a gentle, steady rhythm, a new heartbeat in the archive's chest. The message was unmistakable. Her work was complete, and it was now a permanent part of Dreamwood. A profound urgency filled her. It was time to leave the silence of the archive and return to the heart of the village. She had to assemble the final pieces of her guide, where it had all begun, in the village square, under the open sky. The story was ready to be told. The midday sun warmed the worn cobblestones of the square as Elara unrolled her final map. It was an act of vulnerability, laying bare months of solitary work for all to see. Her sketches of the humming archway and the glowing stream were pinned down by smooth river stones, her field recordings waiting silently in their brass horn. At first, it was just her and the quiet. Then a door creaked open. A window shutter swung wider. One by one, the villagers emerged from their homes and shops. Their curiosity, a gentle, palpable force that gathered at the edges of her makeshift display. Anya the baker wiped floury hands on her apron, her gaze thoughtful. The young weaver from the Glen stood shyly beside Mistress Willow. This was no longer her private project. It had become a communal event, and the weight of their silent judgment made her hands tremble. She could have packed her things, offered a polite explanation, and retreated to the safety of her role as an outside observer. But to do so would be to repeat the very mistake the guardian of the grove had warned against, treating the village as a specimen rather than a partner. The guide would be a hollow thing without their voices. Taking a deep breath that smelled of warm bread and sun-baked stone, she made her choice. She looked up, meeting the eyes of the gathered crowd, her voice clear but soft against the quiet murmur of the square. "I have documented what I could see and hear," she began, "but a map is only lines without the stories that give it life. Would you share with me the sound you love most? The memory that makes this place feel like home." A profound silence followed her question, so deep she could hear the rustle of the willow leaves. For a terrible moment, she feared she had overstepped. Then a young child, peeking from behind her mother's skirts, pointed a tiny finger toward the old stone well. "The noon laugh," she whispered. "When I laugh by the well at noon, the sound comes back to me like a friend." Her mother smiled, a slow, warm dawn of understanding, and added, "And the sound of the rain on the bakery's tin roof, that is the sound of safety. The dam broke." A flood of memories and sensations poured forth, each villager offering a piece of the village's soul. The carpenter described the specific creak of the third step on the library staircase, a sound that had greeted scholars for generations. An elder spoke of the scent of night-blooming jasmine that carried forgotten lullabies on the evening breeze. Elara's pen flew across her journal, no longer just recording facts, but weaving a tapestry of shared experience. Her guide was transforming before her eyes, its authenticity guaranteed by the chorus of voices now writing it with her. And as the stories intertwined, a subtle shift occurred in the very air. The light seemed to grow warmer, the colors of the flowers in the window boxes more vivid. The village's magic, which had felt so fragile, now pulsed with a renewed, collective strength. This communal act of remembrance was not just documenting the magic, it was actively reinforcing it. The climax of her journey was no longer a distant point on a map, but a feeling blooming in the heart of the square, built from the trust and stories of the people she had come to call her neighbors. The final piece of the guide was the soundscape, a woven tapestry of all she had recorded. Elara carefully threaded the wax cylinder into her player, the brass horn aimed toward the sky as a small crowd of villagers gathered in the square. The first notes of the loom's rhythmic creak filled the air, followed by the cheerful babble of the dream stream and the soft chime of the water sprite. A wave of warm recognition passed through the listeners, their smiles a quiet affirmation of her work. But as the recording continued, Elara's own smile faltered. Beneath the baker's warm greeting and the rustle of the willow trees, she heard it, a faint, discordant hum, a sad echo that clung to the edges of every sound like a ghost. It was the same melancholic resonance she had felt at the Moonlit pond, a tangible sign that the magic was fraying even faster than she had feared. Her heart sank. To play this for the villagers now, to tarnish their moment of shared remembrance with this ominous truth, felt like a betrayal. She could stop the recording, present only the beauty, and preserve the cozy fantasy she had so carefully built. But the memory of the Guardian's warning echoed in her mind. A map that ignored the crumbling cliffs was a dangerous lie. Her hand hesitated over the player's switch. The choice was stark. A guide built only on beauty would be a comforting illusion, but a guide that acknowledged fragility would be an honest call to arms. She let the recording play to its end, the sad echo lingering in the quiet square long after the last familiar sound had faded. The villagers' joyful murmurs softened into a thoughtful silence. Anya was the first to speak, her voice gentle but firm. "We have always known the magic was delicate," she said, placing a flower-dusted hand on Elara's shoulder. "But to hear its weakness, it makes the strength we felt today all the more precious." By choosing honesty over comfort, Elara had not broken the village's spirit, she had fortified it. Her guide was no longer just a preservation of what was, but a vital tool for what must be protected. The stakes were now immediate and clear. The lunar cycle was waning, and her finished work had to become a beacon, a way to channel the hope of every person who encountered it back into the village's weakening heart. The silence in the square was not empty but full, a canvas waiting for its final stroke. Mistress Willow stepped forward, her movements as fluid as the threads she commanded, and extended a hand not to Elara, but toward the lane leading back to the Weaver's Glen. The invitation was silent, yet unmistakable. Under the ancient willow trees, the air hummed with a different energy now, one of anticipation rather than creation. The central loom, the very one where Elara's own image had been woven, stood waiting. Mistress Willow presented her with a single spool of thread, its color a shifting silver gray, like moonlight on a path not yet taken. "To weave your story into the tapestry is to bind your fate to ours," the weaver explained, her voice soft but grave. "The thread you choose will become a permanent part of Dreamwood's living memory." A cold knot of doubt tightened in Elara's stomach. Her journey felt like a collection of small, hesitant steps, not a grand epic worthy of immortalization. What story did she truly have to offer? The fear was paralyzing. She could weave a thread of bold adventure, a fiction that would make her seem a heroic figure. Or she could choose a thread of sorrow for the fading magic, a choice that felt honest, but might weaken the tapestry's spirit. Her fingers trembled as she held the spool. Then she remembered the weight of the crystal petal in her pocket, the sound of her own humming, calming a frightened sprite, the patient act of listening in the library. Her worth was not in grand gestures, but in the quiet reverence she had shown every step of the way. The decision crystallized with a calm certainty. She would not weave a lie or a lament. She would weave a thread of quiet discovery, as her hands, guided by Mistress Willow, passed the silver-gray thread through the warp. A tangible warmth spread from the loom up her arms and settled deep within her chest. It was a feeling of roots gently taking hold in welcoming soil. On the tapestry, the simple thread began to glow, weaving itself into the image of the village archway, not as a boundary, but as an open door. A visible ripple of stronger, clearer light pulsed through the entire tapestry, and for a moment, the very air in the glen seemed to brighten. The consequence was immediate and humbling. A portion of the village's vitality was now tied to her own, a personal responsibility that made the stakes breathtakingly real. As the woven thread settled into its place, shimmering with a soft, steady light, Elara's gaze was drawn irresistibly back through the trees, toward the entrance of the village. The final act was clear. The unity she had forged here in the glen had to be sealed at the very beginning, at the whispering archway where her journey had started. The path back to the archway felt both familiar and entirely new, each cobble stone a stepping stone toward a moment of shared truth. Elara led the villagers not as a solitary cartographer, but as one voice in a growing chorus, the spool of woven thread a comforting weight in her pocket. The ancient structure waited, its moss looking less like a velvet cloak and more like a patient face. She did not speak grand words of hope or warning. Instead, she simply set the brass horn of her player on a flat stone and pressed the mechanism. The sounds of Dreamwood flowed out once more, but this time they were not heard in isolation. The baker hummed softly along with the memory of her own oven's warmth. The young weaver tapped a finger in time with the rhythmic creak of the loom. Each villager, listening, added a piece of their own living memory to the recording, their quiet focus weaving an invisible tapestry of attention around the archway. The faint, sad echo that had haunted the playback began to recede, not silenced, but surrounded and comforted by the presence of those who understood its meaning. Then came the hum. It started as a vibration beneath their feet, a deep, resonant note that grew from the stone and the soil, traveling up through their bodies until it filled the air around them. It was the archway's voice, returning not as a whisper, but as a clear, strong song, its melody intertwined with the very recording they were amplifying. The air itself seemed to thicken with potential, charged with the collective will of an entire community choosing to remember. Yet, the magic demanded more than just listening. A recording, no matter how beautifully amplified, was still a record of the past. To truly heal the present, they needed to offer something new, something born directly from this shared moment. Elara felt this truth as a physical pull in her chest. She turned to face the villagers, their faces illuminated by the archway's growing light, and she made the simplest, most profound decision of her journey. She began to sing. It was not a complex ballad or a magical chant, but a simple, old melody of gratitude, a song about the warmth of home and the comfort of familiar sounds. For a heartbeat, there was only her lone voice, vulnerable against the stone. Then, one by one, the others joined. Anya's warm alto, the carpenter's gravelly bass, the children's high, clear notes, all wove together into a single, heartfelt offering. This was not a performance, but a surrender, a channeling of their collective hope directly into the heart of the magic. The archway drank in the sound, its stone drinking the light of the setting sun and the moonrise simultaneously. The moss on its surface began to glow with a soft, green-gold radiance, and the hum swelled into a chord so beautiful it brought tears to their eyes. The light did not flash or explode, but pulsed outward in a gentle wave, washing over the village square, touching the willow trees, flowing all the way to the silent pond. In the wake of that wave, a deep, expectant silence fell, a silence that felt not like an ending, but like a held breath, waiting for the world to be reborn. The final note of their shared song hung in the air, a vibration of pure hope that seemed to crystallize the very moonlight. In the profound silence that followed, Elara stepped forward, the completed guide heavy in her hands. It was more than a book. It was a heart, bound in leather and woven with ink, its pages holding the scent of moss, the sound of the loom, the taste of warm bread. Nestled within its center was the small crystal, a silent vessel containing the soul of Dreamwood. The archway's central stone, which had once been smooth, now revealed a shallow, star-shaped depression. as if it had been waiting for this exact moment. Her hands did not tremble as she placed the guide into the stone. It was not an act of offering, but of returning, a homecoming. For one terrifying heartbeat, nothing happened. The doubt was a cold whisper in her mind, questioning if her sketches were accurate enough, if her words were true enough, if any map could ever truly hold a world. She held her breath, the fate of the village balanced on the edge of a silent question. Then, a light kindled within the crystal, a single point of brilliance that swelled into a wave of pure, white radiance. It did not explode outward with violence, but flowed like a silent tide, washing over the cobblestones, soaking into the roots of the willow trees, rising to touch the highest branches. Elara watched, her heart pounding, as the wave of light reached the Starlight Meadow in the distance. There, the faint, flickering dream lights brightened, their colors deepening from pale whispers to vivid, joyful hues, swirling upward in a renewed, confident dance. The sad echo that had haunted her recordings was gone, replaced by a deep, resonant hum of contentment that emanated from the stones, the trees, the very air. In that breathtaking moment, the conflict that had defined her journey simply dissolved. The tension between observing and participating, between preserving and living, vanished. She understood that her work was not a perfect, permanent cure, but an anchor. It was a story told so well that it had become a source of strength, a new thread woven into the tapestry that the village could now hold on to. She had to let go of the need for it to be enough forever. She had to trust that the stories themselves, now shared and alive in the world, held a power of their own. This release was the final, true resolution. Elara was no longer a visitor with a satchel. She was a guardian with a root-deep connection. As the light settled into a gentle, perpetual glow that bathed the sleeping village, she felt not the pride of an architect, but the quiet peace of a gardener who had tended a rare and beautiful flower, knowing it would now continue to bloom on its own. The air in Dreamwood now carries a different music, a resonance that feels settled and deeply rooted. Elara walks the cobblestone paths not as a stranger with a map, but as someone who belongs, her footsteps a familiar rhythm in the village's daily song. Children wave to her from doorways, and the baker, Anya, always has a warm bun waiting, a simple gesture that speaks of a bond far stronger than ink on parchment. She sees her guide, the physical heart of her journey, no longer resting in the archway's stone, but being gently passed from hand to hand. An elder shares a page with a young child, pointing to the sketch of the stream and recounting the tale of the water sprite in a voice full of wonder. The guide is not treated as a sacred relic to be locked away, but as a living story to be read aloud, its pages touched by flower, dusted fingers, and warmed by the sun. This joyful reverence, this act of communal remembering, is the true magic she has helped to strengthen. The peace she feels is not the absence of change, but a profound acceptance of it. She understands now that her role was never to stop time, but to give the village a voice that could echo into the future. A solitary cartographer arrived here, driven by a fear of loss, but a chronicler of hearts prepares to leave, grounded in the certainty that some connections, once forged, can never be broken. As dusk begins to paint the sky in hues of violet and gold, a new dream light, brighter and more vibrant than any she has seen before, drifts down from the meadow and circles her head once before continuing its journey upward. It does not feel like an ending, but like a gentle question. What other villages sleep in the folds of forgotten maps, waiting for a listener to arrive? What other stories are breathing just beyond the edge of hearing, hoping for a chronicler to weave them into a song that can last forever? The path ahead is open, and every dream light is a new star to steer by. Finn's small, ink-smudged finger traced the winding blue line of the dream stream on the open page, a path he had walked 100 times in his short life. As his fingertip passed over the sketched stone where the water sprite lived, a soft, clear chime echoed through the silent library, a sound that seemed to come not from the book, but from the world outside the window. He froze, his breath caught in his throat, and listened. A moment later, a distant, answering chime floated back from the direction of the stream, a gentle confirmation that the map was alive. Wonder bloomed in his chest, a feeling so large it threatened to lift him from his chair. He was not just reading about the magic, he was touching it. He looked across the room to where Elara sat, her head bent over a new sketch, a quiet figure who had somehow captured the village's heartbeat in leather and paper. A sudden shyness wrapped around him like a cold cloak. What could he, a boy who still stumbled over the tricky route by the bakery, possibly say to someone who conversed with ancient guardians? To speak to her felt like interrupting a sacred ritual, but the memory of that soft chime pulled at him, an irresistible thread of curiosity. The guide was not a finished thing to be admired from a distance. It was an invitation to explore, and the excitement of that possibility was stronger than his fear. He took a deep breath, the scent of old paper and dust filling his lungs, and made his decision. He walked over, his footsteps sounding terribly loud on the wooden floor, and waited until Elara looked up. Her eyes, he saw, were not the stern, scholarly eyes he had imagined, but held a warm, patient light. "Can I help?" he asked, his voice little more than a whisper. "Can I help you add to it?" Elara's smile was slow and deep, a sunrise of understanding. She saw in his eager face not just a reader, but a successor. Her work had taken root, and the first green shoot was reaching for the light. She motioned for him to sit, and as she explained how the sound of the rain on different rooftops created a unique melody, Finn listened, his own knowledge of every creaking floorboard and hidden corner suddenly feeling like a treasure. The guide was no longer her solitary project. It was becoming a communal story, and its survival now depended on voices like his. The idea for the fair began not as a grand plan, but as a simple observation. Elara noticed how Finn and the other children would gather around the guide, their small hands pointing to sketches of the dream lights, their voices inventing new adventures for the water sprite. The book was a seed, but the stories it contained needed room to grow. So she proposed a day, a single afternoon in the village square, where anyone could share a tale, a song, or a memory inspired by the world they all called home. What started as a suggestion quickly bloomed into a vibrant tapestry of its own. On the morning of the fair, the square was unrecognizable. Colorful banners, woven with threads that shimmered in the sun, hung between the rooftops. Makeshift stages appeared, built from old crates and draped with blankets. The air itself seemed to buzz with a joyful energy, a palpable hum that made the flowers in the window boxes sway to a silent rhythm. The magical aura of Dreamwood, once so faint and fragile, now pulsed with a visible, golden light. But as the last story of the afternoon began, a single, cold drop of water landed on Elara's journal. Then another, a dark cloud, unnoticed in the fervor of the celebration, had crept over the sun and now released a steady, insistent rain. The joyful buzz faltered. People looked up, their faces falling as they gathered their things, ready to scatter. The practical thing to do was to end the fair, to retreat to the dry safety of their homes. The spirit of the event, however, wavered in the balance. To let the rain silence them felt like a surrender, an admission that their newfound magic was still a fair weather friend. In that moment of hesitation, the carpenter's voice rang out, clear and strong over the patter of the drops. To the archway, he called, his hand already guiding an elderly neighbor toward the stone gateway. It was not a command, but an invitation. One by one, the villagers followed, carrying their instruments and their stories with them, crowding under the broad, moss-covered stone. The rain did not stop. It fell in silver sheets just beyond the archway's reach, but underneath, a new kind of music began. A storyteller raised her voice, and the rhythm of the rain on the leaves above became her drum. A musician played his flute, and the sound wove itself around the steady downpour, creating a duet with the storm. The threat of an ending had been transformed into a beautiful, unexpected accompaniment. This collective choice, this refusal to let practicality dampen their joy, did more than save an afternoon. It proved a profound truth to everyone present. The magic of Dreamwood was not a delicate thing that needed to be sheltered from the world. It was a resilient force that fed on shared happiness, on adaptability, on the simple, stubborn act of choosing community over comfort. The rain eventually ceased, leaving the world washed clean and sparkling, but the villagers remained under the archway, their stories continuing long into the twilight. That day, the annual storytelling fair was born, not as a date on a calendar, but as a promise they made to each other and to their home. It became the village's heartbeat, a ritual that annually renewed Dreamwood's energy, ensuring that its stories and its magic would never again be allowed to fade. The archway's moss began to hold the warmth of hands resting against it, not in seeking entry, but in quiet listening. A simple ritual took root in Dreamwood. Each evening, a villager would approach the stone gateway, place a hand upon its sun-warmed surface, and listen as the brass horn played back a fragment of the guide's recordings. At first, it was just the familiar sounds, the babble of the stream, the creak of the loom. But when the listener's focus was absolute, when their heart was fully open to the memory, something new would bloom in the air around them. A shimmering, translucent image of Lyra at her first loom might flicker into being for just a breath, her hands moving in a ghostly dance of creation. A child's laughter from a decade past might echo with perfect clarity, a brief, beautiful haunting that felt more like a gift than a specter. The archway had transformed from a guardian into a living story book, its pages turned by the quality of one's attention. This new magic, however, was not without its complications. The carpenter found his apprentices lingering too long by the arch, hoping to catch a glimpse of the great bridge building of their grandfather's time, their work on a new shop, front left unfinished. The gentle allure of the past began to pull at the fabric of the present. Whispers of concern threaded through the community, not of anger, but of anxiety. Are we living in our memories instead of making new ones? A farmer asked Elara one morning, his brow furrowed. Is this beautiful gift making us forget to tend to the fields that feed us? Elara heard the conflict not as a problem to be solved, but as a rhythm to be found. The village needed both the deep roots of memory and the active work of the present. Her solution was not a restriction, but an invitation to harmony. She proposed to the village council that they establish designated listening hours, a specific time each week when the community could gather with intention. The rest of the time, the archway would simply be an archway, a beautiful entrance to a village busy with the vibrant work of life. This was not her imposing a rule, but offering a framework, a way to honor the magic without being consumed by it. Her role had subtly shifted from cartographer to cultural mediator, her deep understanding of the village's heart, allowing her to help it find its own balance. The first official listening hour was held at twilight. The entire village gathered, their collective focus a tangible force. As the recording of the water sprite's chime played, the illusion that appeared was not of the distant past, but of their own recent storytelling fair, the image of themselves laughing in the rain, shimmering briefly in the violet air. The gasp that rippled through the crowd was one of profound recognition. They were not just witnessing history, they were seeing their own stories become part of Dreamwood's eternal tapestry. This formal integration did not diminish the guide's power, it sanctified it. By weaving the listening into the very rhythm of their week, the villagers turned a potential distraction into a sacred practice, ensuring the magic would deepen the roots of their culture without overshadowing the tree. The stakes of Elara's work were no longer about survival, but about sustainability, about creating a legacy that would pulse in time with the heartbeat of daily life. A new, larger book appeared on a reading stand in the library, its leather cover blank and waiting. They called it the Dreamwood Chronicle, and its first entry was not a grand legend, but Anya's simple recipe for the honey rye bread she baked on the first day of autumn, a scent the entire village now associated with the turning of the leaves. This act of beginning with the ordinary set the tone for everything that followed. Each season, the villagers would add their own pages. A farmer sketched the pattern of frost on his pumpkins, one particularly cold harvest. The children, led by a now confident Finn, pressed colorful leaves between the pages and wrote short tales about the whispering forest. The guide was no longer a static record of the past. It had become a living, breathing diary of their ongoing lives. The beautiful consequence was an ever-growing tapestry of village life, rich and vibrant, but this abundance soon presented a delicate conflict. How could they curate this flood of memories without losing the guide's original heart? A page about the precise sound of rain on a new tin roof was beautiful, but did it belong next to the ancient tale of the grove's guardian? The chronicle risked becoming a wonderful, yet chaotic, jumble of moments, its coherence threatened by its own success. The magic was in the sharing, but the meaning was in the connection between the stories. Elara watched this struggle not with worry, but with a quiet certainty. Her most pivotal decision was not to take control, but to gently let it go. She began to train Finn and a small group of other villagers in the archival methods she had learned in the hidden archive. She taught them how to listen for thematic threads, how to group stories that spoke to one another, how to create a simple index so a seeker could find a story of resilience as easily as a story of celebration. She was not appointing gatekeepers, but empowering gardeners, giving them the tools to tend the growing wildflower meadow of their collective memory. This act of decentralization changed the very nature of the guide's magic. Its future was no longer tied to the lifespan of a single cartographer. It was now a shared responsibility, a sacred trust held by the entire community for all time. The stakes were somehow higher and more comforting at once. The survival of Dreamwood's memory now depended on the continued care of its people, on parents teaching their children the importance of adding a new leaf to the chronicle, on elders reminding the young of the stories woven into the oldest trees. The guide had become the village's heartbeat, and every villager was now a keeper of its rhythm. The blank page they spread across the library table was not just paper, but a promise of a new kind of understanding. Elara and Finn worked side by side, their heads bent close, their movements a quiet dance of collaboration. Her hand, steady from years of mapping distant lands, sketched the precise curve of the stream. His small, ink-smudged finger pointed to the exact spot where the willow branches dipped low enough to touch the water, the very place he had first heard the water sprite's chiming reply. This was not a map of distances, but a map of echoes. Each carefully placed mark corresponded to a specific recording from the guide, transforming the physical village into a story you could walk through. A visitor could now stand by the old stone well, press a shell to their ear as the map instructed, and hear the very noon laugh that had once predicted the weather. They could rest a hand on the library's sun-warmed outer wall and feel the vibration of the melodic chime that unlocked the shelves. The consequence was a magic more immersive than any book. Dreamwood was no longer a tale to be read, but a world to be felt, its history layered onto its geography like a second skin. The quiet success of this living map, however, could not be contained. Whispers of a village where stories slept in the stones, traveled along merchant routes, and down river on barges. Visitors began to arrive, not in hostile crowds, but in small, earnest groups. They came with a respectful curiosity, their eyes wide with wonder, their voices hushed. Yet, even gentle footsteps, multiplied, began to wear a new path along the stream bank. The soft moss around the whispering archway showed the first signs of thinning under too many reverent touches. The conflict was as delicate as a spider's web. How could they share this profound magic without loving the village to death? To slam the gates shut felt like a betrayal of the very openness Lyra had woven into its foundation. But to allow unchecked access was to risk the solitude that was the source of the magic's strength. The decision was made not in a council hall, but during a quiet evening, watching the dream lights rise. Finn was the one who voiced the simple, elegant solution. We could be their guides, he said, his gaze fixed on the glowing orbs. We could show them how to walk softly. And so, they instituted a new tradition. Visits were limited to small, guided groups, led by Elara, Finn, or another villager who understood the sacred rhythm of the place. These were not tours, but pilgrimages, where visitors were taught to listen first with their hearts, and only then with the provided shells and listening horns. This careful choice did not hide Dreamwood from the world. Instead, it introduced the wider world to Dreamwood on the village's own terms, teaching a lesson in reverence that every visitor carried back home. The stakes of their stewardship were now magnified, the village's quiet heartbeat echoing cautiously, yet hopefully, into lands far beyond the forest. The first leaf of autumn did not fall. It sang a dry, papery song as it spiraled down to land on Elara's open journal. She had positioned her brass listening horn not toward the sky, but at the forest floor, capturing the symphony of decay and change. This was a new chapter of her work, an attempt to map not just places, but time itself. She recorded the crisp crunch of frost underfoot on a winter dawn, a sound like 1,000 tiny crystals shattering. She captured the gentle percussion of rain on new spring leaves and the heavy, humid silence of a summer afternoon, broken only by the drone of bees. Each season had its own voice, its own rhythm, and she was determined to weave them all into an auditory calendar for the guide. But as she listened to the playback of autumn's rustling chorus, a deep melancholy settled over her. The vibrant greens of summer were now just a memory, preserved only in her sketches. The recording was beautiful, but it was also a ghost, a reminder that this specific moment, with this specific arrangement of golden light and scarlet leaves, was already gone, never to return in exactly the same way. Her project of preservation suddenly felt like a race against an unstoppable tide. Could she ever truly capture something that was defined by its constant state of departure? The conflict was quiet but profound. Should her notes for the guide carry a tone of sorrow for what is lost, or one of pure celebration for what briefly is? The answer came to her on the first truly cold morning of the year. She was in the square, trying to record the unique quality of winter silence, a stillness so deep it seemed to have a sound of its own. Finn approached, his breath misting in the air, and without a word, he placed a single, perfect icicle into her hand. It was cold and clear, already starting to melt from the heat of her skin. "Look," he whispered, holding it up to the low sun. "It has a rainbow inside," and for a moment it does. In that fleeting, brilliant sparkle, Elara understood. The magic was not in fighting the melt, but in marveling at the rainbow while it lasted. Her recordings were not tombstones for dead seasons, they were lullabies. She decided to frame the seasonal section of the guide as a lullaby of change, a gentle reassurance that each phase of the year held its own unique gift. The crackle of autumn leaves was not a funeral dirge, but a cozy promise of coming rest. The deep silence of winter was not an emptiness, but a sacred space for dreams to gather strength beneath the snow. This decision fundamentally raised the stakes of her work. It was no longer just about preserving Dreamwood's magic, but about teaching a way of seeing, a philosophy that could help the villagers and anyone who read the guide find comfort and wonder in the natural cycles of their own lives. The guide would now be a companion for all seasons, a reminder that true magic exists not in defiance of time, but in a heartfelt embrace of its beautiful, necessary flow. The sapling did not simply grow, it listened, planted by the village children on the very spot where Elara had first encountered the guardian of the grove. The young tree seemed to drink in the sunlight and the stories with equal thirst. Its leaves, a vibrant silver green, shimmered with a captured light that mirrored the glow from the guide's crystalline pages when they were read aloud nearby. This was the children's own quiet ritual, a nurturing act that had transformed the sapling into a living symbol of the guide's impact. It was no longer just a record of the past, but a participant in the present, its rapid, graceful growth, a testament to the magic it absorbed. This new, shimmering tree quickly became the heart of the village's informal gatherings. Elders would rest in its dappled shade, their old bones comforted by the gentle hum that seemed to emanate from its trunk. But the true custodians of the tree were the children, especially Finn and his friends. They saw it not as a monument, but as a friend, and like any friend, they believed it needed to be spoken to be told the best tales. This is where a delicate conflict took root. Which stories were important enough to share? Finn argued for the grand, foundational myths, like the tale of Lyra, weaving the village into existence. His friend, a quiet girl named Lyra, named for the founder herself, insisted the tree would prefer the small, secret stories, like the time they found a fox kit napping in the hollow of the old willow. Was the tree a historian or a confidant? The debate, though earnest, threatened to create a new kind of hierarchy, where some stories were deemed more worthy than others. Elara watched this debate from a respectful distance, her cartographer's heart recognizing a critical crossroads. She could easily step in and suggest a balance, or even curate a list of approved tales. But to do so would be to impose an adult structure on a child's instinctive magic. It would risk turning their joyful offering into a homework assignment. The true power of the guide had always been in its ability to spark personal connection, not enforce a canon, so she made a conscious choice. She knelt by the arguing children, not to offer a solution, but to ask a simple question. What story does your heart feel the tree needs to hear today? Her question was a key that unlocked a new kind of creativity. The pressure to choose the right story vanished. Finn, inspired, decided the tree needed a story of courage, and so he whispered the tale of his own first time crossing the stream on the wobbly stone. Little Lyra, hearing this, then shared her story of planting the first seeds in her mother's garden, a tale of quiet patience. One by one, the children began to offer the tree stories from their own lives, small epics of scraped knees and discovered wonders, of friendships forged and fears overcome. They were not reciting history, they were creating it, weaving their own young experiences directly into the tree's shimmering leaves. This decision to empower the children did more than resolve a simple disagreement. It ensured the magic would remain fluid and adaptable. By entrusting the youngest generation with the responsibility of nurturing the tree, Elara guaranteed that Dreamwood's soul would be continually refreshed with new perspectives, new dreams, and new definitions of what makes a story magical. The village's legacy was no longer preserved in amber, but was being actively rewritten with every child's whispered secret. The stakes of their stewardship were now timeless. The guide had given Dreamwood a memory, but the children, through the growing tree, were giving it an eternally young heart, a promise that its most enchanting chapters were always yet to be written. The air in the square was still and expectant, holding the warmth of the afternoon sun as the entire village gathered before the whispering archway. Finn stood at its center, no longer a boy with ink-smudged fingers, but a young man whose shoulders carried the weight of a promise. The ritual was simple, yet its gravity filled the space between every breath. He was to speak the keeper's oath, a vow not just to protect a book, but to safeguard the living heartbeat of Dreamwood itself. The moss on the ancient stone seemed to lean in, listening. As Finn began to speak the traditional words, his voice, usually so steady, caught for just a moment. The faces of his friends, his mentors, the elders who had known him since he was a child, All watched with unwavering trust. But in that sea of faith, a cold knot of doubt tightened in his chest. Was his passion enough? Could his hands, which had only ever added to the guide, truly be worthy of holding its entire history? The immense responsibility of becoming the primary keeper suddenly felt like a mountain he was not prepared to climb. His words faltered, and a silence stretched, thin and fragile. It was in that suspended moment that Elara, standing just behind him, made her final, pivotal choice as his mentor. She did not step forward to speak for him or offer a lengthy reassurance. Instead, she simply placed a warm, steadying hand on his shoulder and leaned close, her whisper meant for his ears alone. "Just listen," she said. Those two words cut through the noise of his fear. Finn closed his eyes, and he listened. He heard the soft rustle of the willow leaves, a sound he had sketched as a child. He heard the distant, cheerful babble of the dream stream, the creak of a loom from the Glen, the collective, quiet breath of his community. These were not just sounds. They were the proof of his belonging, the very music he had sworn to protect. The doubt did not vanish, but it was surrounded, comforted by the familiar symphony of home. When he opened his eyes, his voice returned, clear and strong, weaving the final words of the oath into the air with a conviction that resonated deep within the Archway stone. The transfer of responsibility was complete, not with a grand gesture, but with a quiet passing of the torch. Elara's decision to offer guidance instead of intervention completed her own journey. She was no longer the keeper, but the wise elder who had ensured the legacy would be tended with fresh eyes and a youthful heart. The stakes of the entire endeavor were now forever changed. The guide's survival was secured for another generation. Its stories promised a future told with new passion and perspective. As the villagers pressed forward to congratulate Finn, their joy a palpable wave, the archway itself seemed to sigh, its hum deepening into a contented, enduring note that would echo long into the twilight. The hidden archive, its crystalline heart, still pulsing with the light of Elara's completed guide, began to breathe in a new way. Deep within its quartz-lined chambers, a soft grinding of stone on stone signaled not an opening, but a growth. A new wing unfolded, not carved by tools, but woven from the same living rock that held the oldest stories. Its walls were smooth and inviting, lined with shallow alcoves that seemed to be waiting. The village, feeling this expansion like a gentle tremor in the soil, instinctively understood its purpose. This was a place for the personal, for the small treasures that held entire worlds within them. Anya was the first to approach the new wing, carrying not a book, but the worn wooden spoon she had used to stir her first batch of honey rye bread as a girl. She placed it in an alcove, and as she spoke the memory of her grandmother's hands guiding her own, the spoon seemed to absorb the tale, the wood taking on a faint, warm glow. Soon, a procession began. A farmer left a single, perfectly shaped stone from his field, recounting how it had marked the boundary of his family's land for 5 generations. A child placed a carefully preserved, iridescent beetle wing, whispering the story of the day it had landed on her hand like a tiny jewel. Each memento, no matter how humble, became a vessel for a lived experience, and the archive grew richer, more textured, with every addition. But this beautiful, organic process soon bred a quiet anxiety. The carpenter, a man who took immense pride in his craft, hesitated at the entrance. The beautifully carved bird, he had brought suddenly feeling insignificant next to the foundational myths of Lyra. He wondered if his small story of mastering a difficult joint was important enough to stand beside the tale of the village's creation. Whispers traveled through the square. Should there be a council to decide what is worthy of preservation? If we save everything, will the truly great stories be lost in a sea of the mundane? The archive's generosity had created a conflict about the very nature of history itself. Was it a hall of heroes, or a home for every heart? Elara and Finn stood together before the growing collection, feeling the weight of this question. To curate, to judge, would be to build a new kind of wall around their magic. Finn, remembering his own childhood fear of his stories being too small, looked at the beetle wing glowing softly in its alcove. Its story was not epic, but it was true, and it was a thread in the village's tapestry. Elara nodded, her decision clear. They announced that the only requirement for an edition was that it be offered with a sincere heart. A story's value would not be measured by its drama, but by the truth it carried. This choice to democratize their history changed the archive's very soul. It was no longer just a record of events. It became a living portrait of a community's spirit. The stakes of their stewardship were now profoundly human. The archive's strength became directly tied to the vulnerability and trust of every single villager. Its light now pulsed with the collective rhythm of their joys, their sorrows, their quiet triumphs, ensuring that Dreamwood's memory would forever be held not in a handful of grand tales, but in the countless, beautiful echoes of every life that called it home. The first Starlight Festival was born from a simple, shared impulse to give thanks. As twilight deepened, the entire village gathered in the square, their faces turned upward. Elara's brass horn was placed at the foot of the whispering archway, and with a soft click, the recording of the dream stream began to play. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, from the direction of the meadow, a single, golden dream light rose. It was followed by another, and then a dozen more, until the sky was filled with a swirling constellation. But this was no random dance. As the recording shifted to the rhythmic creak of the loom, the lights responded, weaving themselves into a complex, luminous pattern that mirrored the tapestry of Lyra's first creation. A collective gasp swept through the crowd. This was more than a playback. It was a conversation, a breathtaking spectacle where the village's recorded soul called out, and the living magic answered in a symphony of light. Yet, as the festival became an annual tradition, a subtle fear began to thread through the community's excitement. The spectacle was beautiful, yes, but what if it became a mere performance? What if, after a few years, the dream lights simply repeated the same beautiful patterns, their dance becoming a predictable echo rather than a spontaneous miracle? The carpenter voiced the concern one evening as they planned the third festival. If we only play the old stories, will the magic forget how to dream new ones? The very act of preservation now risked fossilizing the wonder it was meant to protect. The stakes were delicate, a choice between the comfort of a perfect ritual and the vitality of an unpredictable heart. The solution emerged not from a leader's decree, but from a child's game. In the weeks before the festival, the villagers began a new practice. They would gather and tell a story that had never been told before, a tale from the past year, a tale of the great storm that had tested their roofs and their resolve, or the joyful chaos of the new puppies at the mill. They would then weave this new narrative into the festival's soundscape, adding it to the guide's recordings. This collective decision to improvise, to offer the magic of fresh story each year, transformed the event entirely. It was no longer a recitation, but a creation. The moment the new story played, the dream lights would hesitate, their movement becoming a curious, searching swirl before exploding into a brand new, never before seen pattern of light. The gasp from the villagers was now one of pure, joyful surprise. This choice honored tradition while fiercely embracing innovation. It ensured the festival itself became the newest story added to the guide, a living record of how the village continued to dream. Each celebration was no longer an endpoint, but a beginning, feeding the very magic it celebrated and creating an endless, strengthening cycle. The Starlight Festival became a promise the village made to itself and to the future, a vow that their story would never be finished and their magic would never grow old. The decision to leave was written not in ink, but in the quiet fullness of the village square. Elara watched Finn, now the confident keeper, showing a group of young children how to add a pressed autumn leaf to the chronicle. His voice was patient, his gestures sure. Her work was no longer a project, but a pulse, a rhythm now beating strongly in the heart of others. The guide was in the best of hands. That night, by the soft glow of a single candle, she opened the book one last time. On a blank page near the end, she did not sketch a grand map or record a final prophecy. Instead, she wrote a simple, soft narration about the beauty of quiet endings, about how the most profound goodbyes are often those that make room for new beginnings. It was her final gift, a whispered lesson in letting go woven directly into the village's memory. At dawn, when the sky was a pale, watercolor wash of gray and rose, she shouldered her satchel. It felt lighter now, holding only her personal journal and the small, smooth stone from the dream stream. She had told no one of her plans, for grand farewells felt contrary to the gentle spirit of the place. To slip away silently was the most respectful farewell she could offer. Yet as she passed the baker's shop, she saw a single warm bun left on the windowsill, steam still curling into the cool air. It was Anya's quiet blessing, a gesture that spoke of a knowing she had not voiced. The conflict was a quiet ache in her own chest, a sharp tug of love for the cobblestones under her feet and the faces she would not see tomorrow. Being a true guardian, she understood, meant having the strength to step back when the time was right, to trust that the seeds you planted would grow without your shadow. As she walked beneath the whispering archway for the last time, she paused, her palm resting against the familiar, moss-covered stone. She expected the familiar hum, the village's steady heartbeat. But instead, a new sound formed, a vibration that traveled up her arm and settled deep within her, a single, clear phrase woven from gratitude and starlight. Thank you. It was not a goodbye, but a promise. She would always be a thread in Dreamwood's tapestry, her story forever part of its song. And with that quiet assurance warming her heart, Elara stepped onto the path beyond, leaving the village to its bright and dreaming future. The scent of old paper in the distant library was a familiar blanket of dust and silence, until a traveler's curious fingers lifted the cover of a peculiar, leather-bound book. A faint, impossible scent of damp moss bloomed in the air, and a soft, clear chime, like a tiny silver bell, rang out from the pages themselves. The traveler, a pragmatic soul who mapped trade routes and trusted only intangible landmarks, froze. Their logical mind dismissed it as a trick of the light, a draft from a hidden vent, anything but what the book's introduction claimed it to be, a gateway. The conflict was a quiet war within their chest, a deep, aching longing for the kind of magic described in the text, battling against a lifetime of hard facts. They could have snapped the book shut, dismissing it as an elaborate fable for children, but the memory of that impossible chime lingered in their ears, a siren's call more persuasive than any map they had ever followed. Their decision was not a sudden leap of faith, but a slow, deliberate turning of the page to the first-hand sketched map. This single act of choosing curiosity over certainty extended the guide's purpose far beyond the forest where it was written. It proved that a story, once set free into the world, is not a static thing. It is a seed carried on the wind, waiting for the right conditions, a single open heart, to take root and spark a new journey. The traveler's footsteps, now aimed toward a village that might only exist in ink and longing, became a testament to the highest stake of all. Dreamwood's survival was no longer confined to its cobblestone square. Its eternal whisper now traveled on the breath of every new reader, ensuring its magic would never be truly confined to any single map.